Previously, in our journey through the book of Leviticus, we explored the sacred Day of Atonement, the laws of purity, and the holiness required for those who served in the tabernacle. We witnessed how Aaron and his sons were consecrated as priests, how sacrifices were made, and how God's presence was revealed in an awe-inspiring way. But our story does not end there. Today, we continue the incredible journey through Leviticus 17 to 27, where God lays down essential laws about holiness, worship, and daily living for His chosen people. Let's dive right in. God spoke to Moses and gave him instructions for Aaron, his sons, and all the Israelites. He commanded that whenever someone killed an ox, lamb, or goat, whether inside or outside the camp, they must bring it to the entrance of the tabernacle and offer it to God as a sacrifice. If they failed to do this, they would be guilty of shedding blood and would be cut off from the community. This rule was meant to ensure that all sacrifices were brought before God, rather than being offered to false gods or evil spirits, which some people had previously done. This law was to be followed for all generations. God also commanded that anyone, whether an Israelite or a foreigner living among them, who made a burnt offering or sacrifice had to present it at the tabernacle. If they did not, they would be removed from the people. Another strict command was given regarding blood: no one was allowed to eat blood. If anyone did, God would turn against them and cut them off from the community. God explained that the life of all flesh is in the blood, and He had given it to the people to make atonement for their sins on the altar. Because of this, no one was to eat blood, including foreigners living among them. If anyone hunted an animal for food, they had to drain its blood and cover it with dust, for the blood represented life. Anyone who ate an animal that had died on its own or was killed by another animal would be unclean until evening and had to wash their clothes and bathe. After that, they would be clean. But if they did not wash themselves and their clothes, they would be held responsible for their wrongdoing. God warned them not to follow the sinful ways of the Egyptians, where they once lived, or the people of Canaan, where they were going. Instead, they were to obey His laws and live according to His commandments. He made it clear that anyone who follows His laws will find life through them. God then gave specific instructions regarding moral purity. He commanded that no one should have sexual relations with close relatives, including parents, stepmothers, sisters, granddaughters, aunts, daughters-in-law, and sisters-in-law. He also forbade a man from marrying a woman and her daughter or granddaughter, as it was wickedness. Marrying two sisters while both were alive was also forbidden because it would create conflict between them. Additionally, God commanded that no man should have relations with a woman during her monthly period. A man must not commit adultery with his neighbor's wife, as it defiles him. He also strictly forbade the practice of sacrificing children, by passing them through the fire to the false god Molech, as this would dishonor his holy name. God also commanded that men must not have sexual relations with other men, as it was an abomination. Likewise, no one was to have relations with animals, as it was unnatural and disgraceful. He warned the Israelites not to defile themselves with such practices, as the nations before them had done these things, and because of their sins, the land itself had become defiled. Because of this, God had punished those nations and caused the land to drive them out. Therefore, God told the Israelites to keep His laws and not commit these terrible sins, whether they were native Israelites or foreigners living among them. He reminded them that the people who lived in the land before them had done these sinful things, and that is why they were driven out. If the Israelites followed the same path, they too would be cast out of the land. Anyone who committed these abominations would be cut off from the people. God ended by commanding them to obey His laws and avoid the sinful customs of other nations so they would not become unclean. He commanded them to respect their parents and keep the Sabbath. They were not to worship idols or make metal gods. When offering a peace sacrifice to God, it had to be given willingly and eaten within 2 days. Anything left on the third day had to be burned, or the person who ate it would be guilty. When harvesting their fields and vineyards, they were not to take everything but leave some for the poor and strangers. God commanded them not to steal, lie, deceive, or swear falsely in His name. They were not to cheat or rob their neighbors, and they had to pay workers their wages without delay. They were forbidden from cursing the deaf or putting obstacles before the blind, but were to fear God. Justice had to be fair, without favoritism to the rich or poor, and they were not to spread gossip or falsely accuse anyone. Hatred and grudges were not allowed. Instead, they were to correct each other in love and treat one another with kindness. They were commanded to love their neighbors as themselves. They were not to mix different kinds of livestock, seeds, or fabrics. If a man had relations with a slave woman who was promised to another man, she would be punished, but not put to death because she was not free. The man had to bring a ram for a trespass offering, and the priest would make atonement for him. When they entered the promised land, any fruit trees they planted would not be harvested for the first 3 years. In the 4th year, the fruit was to be dedicated to God, and only in the 5th year could they eat it. They were forbidden from eating meat with blood, practicing witchcraft, or looking for signs in the stars. They were not to shave the edges of their hair or beard, make cuts in their bodies for the dead, or get tattoos. They were warned not to force their daughters into prostitution, as it would bring sin upon the land. They had to keep the Sabbath and respect God's sanctuary. They were forbidden from consulting mediums or wizards because it would defile them. God commanded them to respect the elderly and show kindness to strangers, remembering that they were once strangers in Egypt. They were to be fair in business, using honest scales and measurements. They were to obey all of God's laws and live by them. God spoke to Moses and told him to give the Israelites strict instructions about holiness and obedience. He warned them that anyone, whether an Israelite or a foreigner living among them, who sacrificed their child to Molech would be put to death by stoning. God said He would turn against that person and cut them off from the people, because they had defiled His sanctuary and dishonored His holy name. If the people ignored such a crime and did nothing, God would punish not only the guilty person but also their family and anyone who followed them in such evil practices. Likewise, anyone who consulted spirits, witches, or wizards would be cut off from the people. Anyone who cursed their father or mother would be put to death, as they had dishonored their parents. God gave strict laws against sexual immorality. Anyone who committed adultery with another person's spouse would be put to death. If a man slept with his father's wife, his daughter-in-law, or another man, it was a great sin, and both parties would be put to death. If a man married a woman and her mother, it was wickedness, and all 3 had to be burned so that such sin would not spread. Anyone who engaged in relations with an animal was to be put to death, and the animal also had to be killed. If a man married his sister, it was a shameful act, and they would be cast out from among the people. A man was also forbidden from being with a woman during her monthly cycle, as this was considered unclean. Anyone who violated these laws would bear the consequences of their sins. God warned them not to follow the sinful practices of the nations that He was driving out before them. Those nations had committed terrible acts, and because of that, the land itself had become defiled, so God was removing them. He reminded the Israelites that He was giving them a special land flowing with milk and honey and that they were to remain holy because He had set them apart from all other people. They were to distinguish between clean and unclean animals and not defile themselves with anything that God had declared unclean. Finally, God commanded that anyone who practiced witchcraft, sorcery, or consulted spirits must be put to death by stoning, for such people had brought judgment upon themselves. God told Moses to give special instructions to the priests, the sons of Aaron. He said that priests must not make themselves unclean by touching a dead body, except in the case of their close relatives, such as their mother, father, son, daughter, brother, or an unmarried sister. However, a priest who was a leader among the people had to remain separate and could not defile himself in this way. Priests were also forbidden from shaving their heads bald, trimming the edges of their beards, or cutting their bodies as a sign of mourning, because they were to remain holy and not dishonor God's name. Since they were responsible for offering sacrifices to God, they had to be set apart. They were not allowed to marry a woman who had lived an immoral life, or a woman who had been divorced, because they were considered holy before God. If a priest's daughter acted immorally and brought shame upon her father, she was to be punished by fire. The high priest, who was anointed with oil and wore the sacred garments, had even stricter rules. He was not allowed to uncover his head or tear his clothes in mourning. He could not go near a dead body, even if it was his own father or mother, because he had been set apart for God's service. He could not leave the sanctuary, as that would defile it. The high priest was only allowed to marry a virgin from his own people, not a widow, a divorced woman, or someone who had lived an unholy life, because his marriage represented purity among the people. Then, God told Moses to speak to Aaron about the requirements for those who served as priests. Any man from Aaron's descendants who had a physical defect was not allowed to offer sacrifices. This included anyone who was blind, lame, had a deformed face, an injured hand or foot, a hunched back, was too small, had an eye problem, a skin disease, or any other physical defect. Though they were not allowed to approach the altar and offer sacrifices, they were still permitted to eat the holy food that was reserved for priests. However, they could not enter the inner part of the sanctuary or come near the altar because they had a blemish, and God's sanctuary had to remain pure and holy. After hearing these instructions, Moses told Aaron, his sons, and all the Israelites about the laws concerning the holiness of the priests. God told Moses to instruct Aaron and his sons to be careful when handling the holy things offered by the Israelites. They were not to dishonor God's name by treating these sacred offerings carelessly. Any priest who was unclean, whether from disease, bodily discharge, contact with the dead, or touching anything unclean, was not allowed to eat the holy offerings until he was clean again. If a priest became unclean, he had to wash himself with water and wait until evening before eating from the offerings. They were not allowed to eat meat from animals that had died naturally or been killed by other animals, as it would make them unclean. They had to strictly follow these rules to avoid sin and punishment because God had set them apart as holy. Only the priest and those in his household, such as his purchased servants and those born in his house, could eat the sacred food, but hired workers and guests could not. If a priest's daughter married someone outside the priestly family, she could no longer eat the holy offerings. However, if she became a widow or was divorced and returned to her father's house without children, she could eat from the offerings again. If anyone unknowingly ate a holy offering, they had to repay the priest for what they had eaten and add a fifth of its value. The Israelites were warned not to mishandle the sacred offerings or disrespect what was dedicated to God, or they would bear the guilt of their sin. Any animal with a blemish, such as blindness, broken bones, wounds, skin disease, or other imperfections, would not be accepted. If an animal was slightly deformed but not seriously injured, it could be given as a free-will offering but not for a vow. The Israelites were also forbidden from accepting defective animals from foreigners to use as offerings because God would not accept them. When a calf, lamb, or goat was born, it had to stay with its mother for 7 days before being considered acceptable for sacrifice. They were not allowed to kill both a mother animal and her young on the same day. If someone brought a Thanksgiving offering, they had to eat it on the same day without leaving any leftovers for the next day. God reminded them to obey his commands and not disrespect his holy name because he had chosen them as his people and made them holy. God told Moses to instruct the Israelites about the special feasts they were to observe as holy gatherings. First, God reminded them about the Sabbath, a day of complete rest every seventh day when no work was to be done. Then, he gave them instructions about the yearly feasts. The Passover was to be celebrated on the 14th day of the first month, remembering how God brought them out of Egypt. The next day began the Feast of Unleavened Bread, lasting 7 days, during which they had to eat bread without yeast. The first and seventh days were holy gatherings, and no work was to be done on those days. When they entered the promised land and harvested their crops, they had to bring the first sheaf of grain to the priest, who would wave it before the Lord as an offering. Along with this, they had to offer a lamb, fine flour mixed with oil, and wine. They were not to eat any new grain until they had brought this offering. 50 days after the first grain offering, they had to bring 2 loaves of bread made with leaven, 7 lambs, a young bull, and 2 rams for a burnt offering, along with a goat for a sin offering and 2 lambs for a peace offering. This day was to be a holy gathering, and no work was to be done. God also reminded them to leave some grain at the edges of their fields for the poor and strangers. In the 7th month, on the first day, they had to celebrate a day of trumpet blasts, gathering together and offering sacrifices, while doing no work. On the 10th day of the same month, they were to observe the Day of Atonement, a day of fasting and making atonement for their sins. It was a sacred day when no work was to be done, and anyone who ignored this command would be cut off from the people. On the 15th day of the 7th month, they were to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days, living in temporary shelters to remember how God had provided for them in the wilderness. The 1st and 8th days were to be holy gatherings, with no work. They were to rejoice before the Lord by gathering branches from beautiful trees and waving them in celebration. This feast was to be observed every year as a lasting reminder of how God had cared for them when he brought them out of Egypt. Moses shared all these instructions with the Israelites, making it clear that these feasts were to be observed in every generation as special times to honor God. God gave instructions to the Israelites about keeping the lamps in the tabernacle burning continuously. He commanded them to bring pure olive oil to keep the lamps lit from evening to morning as an everlasting law. Aaron was responsible for maintaining the lamps on the pure gold lampstand before the Lord. God also instructed Moses to bake 12 loaves of bread using fine flour and to place them in 2 rows of 6 on the sacred table before him. Each row was to have pure frankincense placed on it as a memorial offering to the Lord. Every Sabbath, the bread was to be set before the Lord as an ongoing covenant, and Aaron and his sons were to eat it in the holy place because it was a most holy offering. Meanwhile, an incident occurred where a man, the son of an Israelite woman and an Egyptian father, got into a fight with another Israelite. During the argument, the man blasphemed and cursed the name of the Lord. The people brought him to Moses, and he was placed in custody until they could hear from God about what should be done. Then, God commanded that the man be taken outside the camp, and all who heard him blaspheme should lay their hands on his head before the entire congregation stoned him to death. God made it clear that anyone who blasphemes his name must bear their sin and be put to death, whether they were a native Israelite or a foreigner living among them. He also gave laws about justice. Anyone who killed another person was to be put to death, but if someone killed an animal, they had to replace it. If a person injured someone else, the same injury was to be done to them, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. These laws applied equally to both Israelites and foreigners, for God was the Lord over all. Moses relayed God's instructions to the people, and they carried out the punishment by taking the man outside the camp and stoning him as the Lord had commanded. God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai and gave instructions to the Israelites about the land and how they should care for it. When they entered the land, they were to let the land rest every seventh year, just as they observed the Sabbath every seventh day. For 6 years, they could plant, prune, and harvest their crops, but in the seventh year, they were to let the land rest completely. Whatever grew on its own could be used for food by everyone, including servants, strangers, and animals, but they were not to cultivate or store it. Then, after 7 cycles of 7 years, making 49 years in total, they were to celebrate the 50th year as the year of Jubilee. On the Day of Atonement, they would sound the trumpet throughout the land to proclaim liberty. In this year, all property was to return to its original owner, and all those who had been sold as servants because of poverty were to be set free and return to their families. No one was to sow or harvest during the Jubilee year, but God promised to provide enough food in the 6th year to last until new crops could be planted and harvested again. The land itself belonged to God, and the people were merely living in it as his tenants. Therefore, land could not be sold permanently. If someone became poor and had to sell their land, a close relative had the right to buy it back, or if the person was later able to redeem it, they could do so. If neither happened, the land would be returned to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. Houses in walled cities could only be redeemed within the first year after being sold, otherwise, they became the permanent property of the buyer and did not return in the Jubilee. However, houses in villages and the land of the Levites could always be redeemed and were to return to their original owners during the Jubilee. God also commanded that if someone became poor, others should help them rather than charging interest or profiting from their hardship. If a poor person sold themselves as a servant, they were not to be treated as slaves but as hired workers. They would serve until the Jubilee year, after which they and their children would be set free. Israelites were God's servants, whom he had brought out of Egypt, and they were not to be treated harshly. Foreigners, however, could be purchased as permanent servants and passed down as an inheritance, but fellow Israelites were never to be oppressed. If an Israelite became poor and sold themselves to a foreigner living among them, they could be redeemed by a relative, or if they earned enough, they could redeem themselves. The price of redemption depended on the number of years left until the Jubilee, and they were to be treated as hired workers, not as slaves. If they were not redeemed earlier, they and their children were to go free in the year of Jubilee. God commanding them not to make or worship idols of any kind, for he alone is the Lord. He reminded them to keep the Sabbath and show reverence for his sanctuary. God promised that if they obeyed his commandments, he would bless them abundantly. He would send rain in the right seasons, making the land fruitful, ensuring they always had enough food. They would live in peace, without fear of danger, and their enemies would fall before them. Even a small group of Israelites would be able to defeat much larger armies because God would be with them. He promised to multiply them, keep his covenant with them, and dwell among them as their God. However, if they refused to listen and disobeyed his laws, God warned that they would face severe consequences. He would bring fear, sickness, and sorrow upon them. Their hard work would be in vain because their enemies would take everything from them. If they continued in their disobedience, God would punish them even more severely. He would make the skies like iron and the ground like bronze, preventing their crops from growing. Wild animals would attack them, their enemies would conquer them, and cities would be destroyed. If they still did not repent, famine would grow so extreme that they would be driven to eat their own children. God would destroy their false places of worship, scatter them among foreign nations, and turn their once prosperous land into a desolate place. But even then, God's mercy remained. He said that if they confessed their sins and humbled themselves, he would remember his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He would not completely abandon them, nor break his promises, because He is the Lord their God. Even when they were suffering in foreign lands, He would still watch over them. God gave instructions about vows and offerings made to Him. If a person made a vow to dedicate someone to the Lord, the value of that person would be determined based on their age and gender. A man between 20 and 60 years old would be valued at 50 shekels of silver, while a woman of the same age would be valued at 30 shekels. The value decreased for younger and older people. If someone was too poor to pay the set amount, the priest would determine a fair value based on what they could afford. If an animal was given as an offering to God, it became holy and could not be exchanged for another animal, whether good or bad. If an unclean animal was offered, the priest would decide its value, and if the owner wanted to buy it back, they had to pay the value plus an additional fifth of the amount. If someone dedicated their house to God, the priest would set its value, and if the owner wanted to redeem it, they had to pay the value plus 1/5. If someone dedicated part of their land to God, its value was based on how much seed was needed to plant it, and the value would depend on how many years remained until the year of Jubilee. If the owner wanted to redeem it, they had to pay the set value plus 1/5. If they sold the field to someone else, it could not be redeemed. In the year of Jubilee, the land would return to its original owner unless it had been devoted permanently to God, in which case it would belong to the priests. The firstborn of animals already belonged to God, so they could not be dedicated separately. If the firstborn was an unclean animal, the owner could buy it back by adding 1/5 to its value. Any object or person devoted to God in a permanent way could not be sold or redeemed, and certain things dedicated to destruction could not be saved. God commanded that 1/10 of all produce, whether from the land or animals, must be given to Him as a tithe. If someone wanted to redeem any part of their tithe, they had to add 1/5 to its value. When counting animals for the tithe, every 10th one belonged to God, and it could not be exchanged. If someone tried to switch an animal, both the original and the exchanged one would be considered holy and could not be redeemed. These were the commandments that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai for the Israelites. The story of Leviticus 17 to 27 teaches us profound lessons about holiness, obedience, and trust in God's commands. It reminds us that God has called His people to be set apart, living in purity and righteousness before Him. We learn that worship must be done according to His will, not through human desires or idolatry. These chapters emphasize the sacredness of life, the importance of justice, and the value of honoring God in every aspect of life. God's appointed feasts remind us to rest in Him and celebrate His faithfulness. The laws regarding land, property, and servitude teach us about stewardship, fairness, and redemption, showing that God is just and compassionate. Through blessings for obedience and warnings for disobedience, we see that walking in His ways leads to life, peace, and abundance, while rejecting His commands brings hardship. Ultimately, this passage calls us to honor God in all we do, trust in His provision, and live as His holy people, reflecting His character in the world. And so, the book of Leviticus closes with a call to holiness, obedience, and faithfulness. God had set Israel apart as His own people, and they were to reflect His holiness in every part of their lives. This is just the beginning of their journey. Next, we will step into the book of Numbers, where we see Israel's travels, trials, and triumphs in the wilderness. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful Bible stories. Stay tuned for the next adventure in God's unfolding plan.